So I'm Shruti Ajitsaria. I'm a partner at A&O Sherman. I was for very many years a credit derivatives lawyer, so I always feel very privileged that you'll let me come and speak at this conference, despite the fact that I spent 15 years being an ISDA girl. And I now head up Fuse, which is our tech incubator. And I just wanted our panelists to quickly introduce themselves. So James.
Hi, I'm James Kanagasorian. I'm the Chief Research Officer of the technology and polling firm Focal Data, and sometimes try and spare doing columns for the Times on social and cultural trends.
Jeff Tyson. I spent the last 5 years as a partner at Bain & Company, where I had the pleasure and privilege of leading our fintech practice globally. I left that business at the end of last year. I'm still an advisor to the business, and I'm now building a new AI-native consulting business.
And I'm Tara Waters. I'm a former corporate and capital markets lawyer, and most recently was a partner at Ashurst, as well as the chief digital officer there, and I led our AI strategy. After Ashurst, I set up my own digital consultancy, and now I'm a legal innovation partner at Harvey, the leading legal AI company.
Okay, so we're going to cut this conversation really into 3 parts. James, we're going to talk really first about the data and what that's telling us about the changes in the workforce today. Jeff, we're going to talk about organizational structures and what that means for businesses. And then Tara, you were kind enough to offer to talk about what the change from Ashurst to Harvey has meant for you in practice and some of the things that you've learned about how people's ways of working might be changing going forward. So, James, starting with you, do you want to just tell us a bit about the study that you've been doing with the FT and what you've learned so far?
Thanks, Shruti. So in our work with the Financial Times, Focal Data have partnered basically to provide a monthly poll of workers across the US and the UK to kind of really understand what's going on with adoption of AI tools, what's going on in the workplace, are people using them, how is the jobs changing effectively, what does this mean? And really providing truth to power, I think, on this particular issue, because a lot of senior-led conversations we felt, and the Financial Times felt, weren't quite accurately reflecting what was going on in the workplace, particularly at the mid and junior levels in terms of adoption, how people felt about it, what they thought was going on in the labour market. So that's what we've been doing for the past 2 months. The second tracker finished last week, and I've got a couple of highlights, which is obviously a bit dry, having followed the general and a kind of generational CEO, but I'll try my best to make it exciting. You know, fundamentally what we see is that 40% of the workforce, whether that's across the US or the UK, it's quite similar, basically not using AI tools at all. And that's particularly acute across the over 55s. And then you get a kind of occasionals, another 40%, who are kind of using it on a kind of maybe monthly basis or maybe once every couple of weeks. It's more of a curiosity thing. And it's really only a hardcore of the kind of remaining 20% or so who are very interested in how tools are used, who want the kind of training that comes with that, who are kind of exploring the different tools. And that 20% really subdivides into kind of 10 and 10, where really it's around 10% of people are using this every day, all the time, full integrations, you know, people using Claude, using VS Code, using different tools, creating fully agentic systems or trying to explore that. And from my perspective, that's very interesting because there's a 2-speed conversation going on. You know, I write about AI quite often, either it's a blog or a newspaper column, and it's a lot like writing about the royals, which is that half the people ignore what you're writing immediately and turn the page, and the other half are quite interested. And I think that's really important to reflect in kind of conversations like this, which is that there's a completely 2-speed kind of conversation going on. I think the other thing that comes out from the data, which is kind of already reflected, is that the adoption curve is not normal. It's not a regular kind of adoption curve. This isn't a kind of inexorable rise where the entire population are going to basically use these tools with mass scale adoption. We are seeing a very stubborn 40 to 45% of people who have no interest, don't actually have pressures from work to kind of achieve that. And as I said, you have the kind of hardcore 20% and the 40%. So it's very unusual, which is leading to kind of a bifurcated market in terms of what different people are doing, different aspects of the labor force, different types of industries. This is very, very split, by the way, I should say, by sectors. You know, we're going to have a conversation later on, I think, about what's happening in the legal sector. I work in market research. If you're a pollster, and I should be clear, I went on the radio the other day and someone thought I did up sofas. It's the act of gaining people's information and trying to understand what they're doing. I'm apparently, according to the International Labour Organization, occupy the 7th most automatable job possible in the world, I think out of more than 20,000 jobs, which is a good thing. And you know, from our perspective, certainly, we're picking up on this bifurcation in extreme. The AI native workers are actually now trending towards kind of middle management who are surviving and learning to kind of adopt, plus senior workers who are very excited and are full of different kind of anecdotes about what they've used ChatGPT for,
Yeah.
and what that means. And then actually the squeeze at the junior end of the market, where we're seeing massive contraction of the number of junior level white collar jobs. We call this the collar flip. We've done a lot of research on it, which is not being replicated in blue collar jobs in terms of robotics and kind of automation. And fundamentally, that's going to create a lot of pressure. We're going to have a legacy problem. We're going to have a pipeline problem. We're going to have a training problem. A lot of the skills that people pick up by doing quite simple tasks on a repeated basis are not happening. So things like instinct, expert knowledge, depth of knowledge, what you call an apprenticeship, basically, of really understanding domain expertise isn't happening. People have been given a spaceship on their first day of work.
And that's quite frightening when we think about what the last speaker just said about the most important thing being the exercise of judgment. How you accrue that judgment over a period of expertise seems now practically impossible, I think, for the generation that's coming up behind us.
Yeah, well, the last thing I think, just to say on that FT kind of polling tracking exercise, is that we're going to be looking at something called metacognition over the next year or so. I think metacognition is going to become a big thing. It's going to become a word that I think that almost everyone in this room will hear a lot over the coming years. And basically, it's the idea or the exercise that you think about how you're going to think. And what we're seeing at a hiring level is that judgment over how to structure thinking and how to think about thinking is now becoming an extremely powerful tool, because of course the execution of particular jobs is now becoming commoditized. And therefore people who have a particular skill at organizing how they think about things and structuring different things and marshalling different things, which is what you do when you're faced with multiple different tools, is become really important. And that's going to completely change who we think of as quite skilled and who is kind of has a differential advantage.
And when we come to talk about the personal perspectives, I'm going to pick up on that again, actually, in terms of the lessons that you would want to pass on to your children from a perspective of being prepared for a world in which metacognition will be the key skill that you can sort of demonstrate. Jeff, you've heard something about the data. Is what you're hearing from James reflected in what you're seeing businesses evolve into? Or do you think that people correctly understand what the data is actually telling us? And do you think people are setting themselves up from an organisational perspective correctly now to facilitate what the world's changes are going to be?
The short answer is yes, but I think it very much depends. Having spent an awful lot of time in bank boards and executive teams around the world in the last couple of years, I think by now every organization will have an AI strategy. The challenge for most of them is how do we drive adoption? We were asked a couple of weeks ago by one of the big...
Can I interrupt you to say, I think that's right, but I'm interested to know what you think about the quality of those AI strategies.
Questionable is what I would say. Right?
Because my sense is a lot of people feel under pressure to create an AI strategy, so they sort of dump some words down on a page and like make a little like PowerPoint presentation with some arrows. But just from what you've seen, what would you say are the component parts of a good AI strategy, and sort of taking some of the lessons I think from the last speaker, like what is the end point? Where are we trying to get to? What problem are we trying to solve? Are we asking the right questions? Do we have the context? You know, where is the AI strategy creation piece going wrong?
Well, I think you're absolutely spot on. I think if the four of us were to lock ourselves in a room, I'm fairly certain we could come up with a pretty compelling AI strategy on paper. To what extent is that? Again, when it comes to driving adoption, you know, and implementing that, it's a very different story. And I think that applies to a business that has 20,000 people, in the case of Bain, for example, but it applies to smaller businesses as well. And I think you're absolutely right that working backwards from what are you actually trying to achieve? And I think the common mistake that a lot of organizations make, you know, that I've spoken to as well, is they either see this as yet another innovation project or a technology transformation project, without really failing to understand the implications on your business model, your operating model, your talent strategy, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's, to me, if an organization says, well, we've got 127 different AI proof of concepts that we're running, how many of those actually see the light of day? Right? And again, I think that's one of the common mistakes that many organizations make, not just in financial services, to be clear.
I think you were going to go on to talk a bit about adoption as well and what you see as being sort of the levers that you need to pull to ensure that you have good adoption within your organisation. What have you seen so far?
Well, I mean, James talked about the importance of training, which obviously I very much agree with. But to me, when it comes to AI, this isn't just, and again, a common mistake that I see so many times, that I've witnessed so many times in the past couple of years is, this isn't something you outsource to your chief innovation officer or your CTO or your CIO, right? And I had a fascinating discussion with a client the other day. So they wanted to do an AI training curriculum for the top 200, the 200 most senior execs in the firm. And again, on paper, they had an AI strategy. The reality was very, very different. And then when we talked about the fact that we don't just want this to be a theoretical exercise. We don't just want to get everyone in a room for a couple of hours and talk about what's happening in the world. Right? How is the industry evolving? What does it mean for your business? No, we said we actually want to get hands on keyboards. And we actually want them to go and build something. And they're like, no, we can't do that. We can't get our top 200s to actually play around with some of these tools. And I think this builds on the point that James is making, which I think is an excellent point, where there's so many people. I mean, the guys in our team, every breathing hour, they're effectively playing around with this. They're building stuff. And they're not just engineers. Right? And I think in a lot of organizations, we talk about the fact that it's the bottom part of the pyramid, whether that's in a big consulting firm or whether that's in a law firm or any large corporate. It's the bottom part of the pyramid that's the most effective. Right? What I saw at Bain, for example, is the youngsters, they're all playing around with it. It's the middle part, but also the top part of the organization. That's the hardest part to transform.
And Tara, I'm just curious to know if you think that the training aspect particularly is very different when you're in a traditional large organisation where you just everything is covered and shrouded in bureaucracy versus your experience of being in Harvey. What has the training aspect felt now that you've moved to Harvey? Is there any difference to you that you've been able to see in lessons that people might be able to pick up on?
I mean, definitely. I think Harvey is still a startup. It's just under 4 years old. So from a training perspective, we're inundated with information and we're expected to absorb it on the fly, often virtually and asynchronously. Like we are mandated to not have lots of meetings and spend lots of time sitting in rooms around tables. To the extent possible, we try to build 80% before we actually get people around the table, because velocity is essential to us, staying ahead of what's happening in the market. I think in a highly structured organization like a law firm or a more traditional team, training is often a white glove thing. You force people at Ashurst, we force people to come in on the training days, to get around the room, talk to each other, to try to be more hands on keyboards, hands on documents, to really walk through each thing that you need to learn in a bit more of the apprenticeship model, which is increasingly difficult to do with, in particular, when you're talking about new technologies and the skill sets that need to come along with understanding how to use those technologies. It requires a much faster paced experience and probably a willingness to work a bit more virtually and asynchronously and take on more of that responsibility yourself, which is very challenging also in an environment where people are hyper-focused on the hours they're spending and where they're spending their time.
And James, does the data unlock any lessons for us in how to make sure that you are focused on training, or is there a particular demographic that is lagging behind?
So on training, the track is quite clear, which is that 13% of workers currently, as a blended average across the US and UK, have had formal training in terms of how to use tools. And around 21% of people, it's not very around, it's quite a specific number, 21% of people wish to have formal training, but currently don't have that available. And the reason that matters is because around 57% of people who've had training then use AI every day. And the stats, in terms of then looking at the people who use AI every day, 10% of that group feel that they basically saved on a productivity basis almost a whole day per week. And a much larger number, almost twice that number in terms of a couple of hours. So the productivity gains that we've seen from the people who have used it, who have been trained, seem quite large. I'm not sure that can be sustained all the way through. but certainly the lack of formal adoption, and there's a big problem here because, you know, when we go into different companies and we see what's happening in terms of training schedules, you know, it's very hard to now verify who is an expert. You know, there's lots of people giving talks about AI and coming in and giving training on AI, and they don't know how to code. They've literally never used AI before, and then talking to other groups of people who haven't learned how to code and are vibe coding. So it's like two sets of people and two interlocutors basically talking about something which, from a systems basis, there's actually not enough information going out there. And I think there's a lack here of kind of accreditation. But what I would say is just to kind of speak to the point about the white glove training, which is a fantastic way of putting it. The thing that's now most scarce is judgment. In the future, you know, we're already seeing demand from clients where they're asking for aspects of a job to not be used with AI. So it's becoming like an organic food label, where you're basically imprinting on this piece of work. This has had senior level judgment and hasn't had a path dependency that's been AI led. So I think there's a lot of complexity here because yes, there's demand for training. Yes, there's a demand for augmentation as opposed to just pure automation. But I think there's already concerns about the degree of judgment, and that's why we spoke about metacognition. You can now have something that has the appearance of knowledge and the appearance of information and doesn't have it. You know, just this week, I think Sir John was talking about politicians. You know, there were a lot of open letters in the press this week between a future Prime Minister and a current one and a former one. And one of those responses failed an AI test on Pangram, which meant that one of them was basically created entirely synthetically. And that, you know, that's a problem. If that's happening right at the top, can you imagine what's happening all the way through? And one of them had the appearance of information but wasn't. So I would caution a note of skepticism. You know, Focal Data, we were the first fully agentic AI research firm in Europe, and you know we're growing fast. We're Britain's 30th fastest growing company, but yet I'm sat here and I'm extremely hesitant. I'm quite skeptical about a lot of what's happening. So training is good as long as it's real training, and again that's very hard. Accreditation and judgment are now really, really hard.
Can I just build on that quick? Because, of course, every single individual in the organization should receive training, from the CEO to the junior associate. But then I'm sure that we've all been in many different training sessions and offsites where it's yeah, hooray, and it's really interesting and exciting, and we spend a couple of hours you know, learning about topic X, Y, Z. We go back to our day jobs and nothing changes. Right? And ultimately, it's at the risk of stating the obvious, it is about the application. Right? You can give everyone in the room a gym membership to the most exclusive gym in London. That doesn't mean that in 3 to 6 months we're all going to have a six-pack. Right? And I think that's
very disappointing.
I know. If only it was that easy. Right? But I think this is one of the key challenges that many organizations. Of course, we should be doing training, but then also keep in mind that, you know, with Claude doing a new release every couple of weeks, if not every couple of days, keeping up is harder than it's ever been before.
Yeah, and I think to Tara's point, the understanding of training and what that constitutes, if it is keep up, you're part of your training, it's your responsibility, you need to keep up and you need to absorb the information and no one is going to come and spoon feed it to you. That is a very different understanding of training to what I think I, for example, have been used to in my organisation, which is come here, I'm going to lure you with a sandwich lunch and some free crisps, and someone's going to stand here and click through some PowerPoints and you're going to sit and listen and we're going to feed it to you. And I think that training is itself going to have to move quite quickly from being that to something more akin to what Tara described. And just, James, to pick up on your point about the organic food stamp, because I think that's a really interesting point. I also think we're going to see things, and I'm interested to hear all of your perspectives, move in waves, because we, for example, as a law firm, are being pushed by clients regularly to use AI, use more generative AI, reduce costs. And then quite recently in the press, there was a case of an American law firm who had submitted some citations as part of some documentation to a court, and it turned out the citations had been wrongly generated and they hadn't been checked. Now, that to me would have been like not necessarily the judgment layer, that would have been like the sort of general checking layer of work that fell through the cracks. And yet there's been this immediate swing back really, which is like, okay, but is there a human in the loop in absolutely everything? Is someone checking absolutely everything that's happening? So it's been a very quick swing from must use generative AI in all cases that you can to produce efficiency to, oh, no, we really want humans to cover every single bit of it, not just the judgment, not just the organic food stamp, but actually every single layer, because we now recognise that things are not always going to be quite right. And I'm interested to know if you have a sense, any of you, of where that might settle and how.
I think my response to that would be follow the incentives. So for people whose clients are demanding that they use AI, what's their incentive? Well, it depends who's doing the commissioning. So if, for example, it's a GC who has commissioned the work, they're worried about how much, what's the opportunity cost? I can get a boilerplate contract done using AI. I want to be able to lower my costs. But if it's a senior decision maker, for example, they might see that there's a long-term consequence of doing this. And when law firms, I mean, Tara can speak to this, when you are being staffed, do your clients have a long-term stake in the fact that you have skilled lawyers in 15 years? I would hesitate to say probably not. And so therefore following the incentives, I think will tell you where this is likely to go. We're looking at the tracking about what are the different roles that people will play. There's the checker, there's the judgment maker, there's the person that's the marshaller, because a lot of these tools require different people to marshal different things. And I think those roles will grow. We don't even have names for those at the minute. We're basically making up terms for people's new jobs. But certainly, I think we would expect hallucinations to decrease over time. That's far too many conversations become about hallucinations. Yeah. Let's imply that that's going to be solved over time. I still think there's going to be demand at some stage for someone to be like, is this a high cost of failure decision? Because if it is, there are mixed incentives here. Because if something really, really matters with a high cost of failure, I'm not sure that you can just continue to deploy AI solutions.
And that brings me on to my next question, which is, Jeff, it was really interesting to hear John talk about leadership, but one of the biggest challenges I think that will face modern leaders is the talent pipeline, and you alluded to that earlier, James, but I do think that is really where this whole thing starts to fall apart, is what advice do you have to anyone right now about building that talent pipeline in an intentional way such that they can do the things that James is saying they'll need to be able to do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was asked by Oxford to come and give a talk to their exec MBAs a couple of weeks ago, and rather unsurprisingly, this is one of the key topics that we ended up talking about. And I think that there's been so much focus in the past couple of months or couple of years really on, again, as James is also alluding to, how is this affecting the bottom part of the pyramid? How is this affecting young talent that is entering the workforce? Which is a very, very valid question. And for someone who's got a 7-year-old little princess, I mean, by the time that she turns 23, who knows what she's going to do? But then, as James also pointed out, I think it's creating new jobs. And I don't necessarily think we're going to see a massive displacement of junior consultants, for example, or junior lawyers. If anything, I think it's going to make everyone much more effective, but it does depend on what's your stance and to what extent are you actively playing around with some of this. Don't wait for whatever organization you're working for to come to you and say, hey, Jeff, we would like you to go on an AI training course to help you build more foundational skills so you can actually utilize this on a day-to-day basis. I think it goes way beyond that. I do think it's very important for organizations to think about what's the type of talent we need in this new world that we live in. And again, and I see this in financial services, the pace of change that we're seeing today is unlike anything I've ever seen before. And I've spent my entire career in financial services. And on one hand, that is very, very exciting. On the other hand, that is very, very scary. And again, I think, to me, when it comes to talent, this isn't just about the bottom part of the pyramid. I think we need to rethink every single layer in those organizations. I think we need to rethink to what extent do we still need 17 layers of governance within an organization, right? As well as, again, the talent required to build the successful organizations of the future. And I think what we will see, and this is already starting to emerge, I think Harvey is a great example of that. I think that the consulting firm of the future or the law firm of the future or whatever type of business it might be isn't necessarily going to be a 10,000 person business. Right?
Tara, tell us then about the transition from an Ashurst to a Harvey, what lessons have you learned about talent, about the skill set that's going to be needed, and how are you seeing, because you'll be seeing some of that in practice now, and you'll also be seeing what it is that you think law firms will be needing to be doing in the future and other professional services, and probably extends to way beyond that. So what have you learned?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting, and I'm part of a new team, and there's 7 of us that are brand new legal innovation partners, and we're really the first wave of very senior people coming out of the legal industry and moving into the technology, the legal technology space, other than people that decided to become founders at some point. So I think there's actually been a good pipeline over the past few years of more junior talent moving in, becoming these legal engineers at a lot of technology companies. And I think what we've seen is now in this world where AI is pervading, especially the legal industry. I mean, I can't imagine what it'd be like to be in one of the roles where you're not at threat and feeling the pressure of having AI be part of your life day to day. I would love to just have 24 hours of that, in fact. Sadly, I don't. And these new avenues for people actually have been opening up in legal for the past decade, for as long as we've really been working in the innovation and technology space in the industry. But I think that's really shifted in a different way, where there are proper careers and different career paths. So I think for someone, who's quite senior and has had kind of a long career, has sat in a senior and leadership level in an organization, the ability to actually come in, but not have to somehow become a salesperson or become a tech person or a product person, but actually come in, and there was a recognition that our experience of working within these organizations, we understand the politics, we understand the structure, we understand the governance, we understand how to navigate them, we understand the pains and pressures that they're going under. It's actually become really essential for companies like Harvey to have that internal perspective and to internalize that now into the way we are servicing our clients. And we very much are shifting more to saying, we have 2 key offerings. One is the product and one is the partnership, and that partnership is service-led.
James, do you have any thoughts about what Tara just said in terms of the data that you've seen coming out now, and how far away you think the gap is, I suppose, between how quickly something like Harvey is moving in terms of job roles available, in terms of ways of thinking, and where sort of the rest of the UK and the US workforce actually sits in reality?
So we, about last year, we did a very long-form piece of analysis where we took, according to the International Labour Organization, every single job type. I think there were like 46,000, and then created a model to estimate levels of automation by seniority and by job function and aspects of the job. And it was quite interesting. I think law has headed a certain way. Some of that is to do with labour market dynamics. You've got newly qualified lawyers coming out on salaries of 160, paid more than the Prime Minister. I think that is led to a demand for innovation.
Does that say something about the quality of our Prime Minister? Couldn't help it, just came out. I don't know what happened.
Absolutely no comment. But estate agents are very interesting people to talk to, right? They will tell you something as unique has happened in the legal sector, which is that if you go around bits of London, particularly West London, North London, and you ask them, who owns all the houses, it used to be quite a wide variety of people. Now it's just lawyer here, lawyer there, lawyer there, lawyer there. And it's interesting the kind of contraction in terms of types of jobs. So I think there's something very unique going on in the legal sector in terms of kind of getting a kind of equilibrium there. But what I would say in terms of what we've also seen from the data is that it's very specifically, the people most at risk is not the top, not the very, very bottom, but a seam basically at the managerial level where people are slightly struggling to use the tools, where there are tools that can literally do very rote tasks in very specific ways immediately at almost marginal cost. And that's automation. We're struggling to find augmentation in time for those jobs. Take market research, as I was mentioning before, 80% of the value stack or the job stack, or whatever you want to call it, has been automated. That has been around for 40 years and it's disappeared in half a year, which means that my firm is a quarter of the size of what it would have been even 5 years ago. And we can augment people, but just on a raw mathematical basis, that's not happening. That's also reflected in the salaries. So, for example, software engineers, I think salaries are overall up by 15%, but that's massively different since the opening of ChatGPT. That's massively different by different types of sectors. So there's been a political reaction to this. I think at the next election here in the UK, you will see an anti-AI party. I think that you will see very wide structured social movements. The same thing is happening in the US, by the way, as well. The Republican Party is currently literally engaged in open civil war on the issue of AI, and it remains to be seen what will happen depending on who is settled on as a candidate to succeed Donald Trump. So this stuff's getting very real. I don't think that's really reflected in a lot of the boardroom conversations that I hear, where people are just delighted that they don't have to have 2 secretaries anymore because they've got ChatGPT. It's kind of quite a surface level joy. And so I'm very interested to see where this goes next.
Right, well, conscious, James, that AI hasn't yet managed to figure out how to get you onto the radio very, very shortly, and we're going to have to let you go. I just wanted to close that by asking each of you, particularly in the context of John's session on leadership, what do you think that leaders should be most focused on now? So, Tara.
Yeah, I mean, my advice for leaders is to actually start thinking about what disruption actually looks like for your organization, because it may, per the Bill Gates quotes, it may not be the next 2 years, but it's coming in the next 10 years. And I think the preparation for that and the thinking around that needs to be happening now.
Jeff.
There's 2, if I may. So one, stop using this. As I said before, this is not an innovation project or a technology transformation project, but stop using it or mostly seeing this as a productivity tool. How do I make my existing employees more effective? It's the wrong way of looking at it. And then I think there's 2, and again, building on the training point, is there's training, which is the foundational stuff. But there's a lot of people, again, at different levels in the organization who are very, very concerned about what this means for them. What does it mean for my future? So to what extent can you also paint, and again, thinking about how is this disrupting my business, but also paint an exciting vision of what does this mean for the business? And to what extent do we want everyone in the firm to be part of this rocket ship? Right? Where do we see the organization going in the next couple of years? And again, what exciting opportunities does this unlock for my people and for the business more broadly?
James.
Very briefly, what is the most valuable human behavioral skill? Because it becomes very different. So I've spent the last 10 years hiring mostly very quiet people who have STEM backgrounds and engineering backgrounds. And that's basically now just flipped entirely on a 180. So now, we have 50 developers and engineers, but now I'm looking for people that have done English at university, who are more extrovert, who have the ability to communicate and be charismatic and be able to listen and to be able to marshal. And I think all the truisms that we've learned over the past 10, 15 years, I'm not sure that they stand. So for me, it's like what makes people most human.
I just heard you say charismatic and look directly at me, so thank you. I'll take that as a compliment. I'm greedily going to have my own, which is just to say I feel like the conversation around diversity has been somewhat left behind in this country and others. And I think the question of cognitive diversity has been completely left behind as well. And I think now more than ever, when we have these discussions and we're talking about different forms of training, different forms of people, different forms of exercising judgment, cognitive diversity will become more and more important. And for leaders now who are facing this enormous question where they don't know, they haven't tried it, they've not been in the training, it's all brand new, what I have noticed is a real retreat to traditional thinking and surrounding themselves with people who say things in a way that they can understand because it helps them to access the new information. And the one thing I would say for leaders that they need to be really careful of is to remember that cognitive diversity is really important in good decision making because it's that will help them to exercise good judgment going forward. So thank you very much all for having us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.